The rain was a physical malice, a cold chisel against her bones. It fell not in sheets but in solid, driving spears that turned the earth to a sucking maw of mud and stone. Every ragged breath Alara drew was a gasp of icy water, her lungs burning with the effort of running. The forest was a labyrinth of skeletal fingers, bare branches clawing at her torn dress, at the raw, weeping gash on her arm. She could no longer feel the pain of it, only a distant, throbbing numbness that was part of the greater misery of her body. Her bare feet were shredded, the sharp edges of shale and unseen roots leaving a trail she prayed the deluge would erase. He was behind her. The thought was not a conscious one anymore, but a primal rhythm hammered into her soul with every frantic beat of her heart. He was behind her, and the storm was her only shield, a roaring, violent accomplice in her desperate flight. But the shield was also a weapon against her, sapping the last of her strength, blinding her with its fury. The world had dissolved into a churning chaos of gray and black, a landscape of despair where the sky had fallen to smother the land. She stumbled, her ankle twisting with a sickening crack of bone on rock. A scream tore from her throat, swallowed instantly by the gale. She fell hard into the mire, the impact jarring through her exhausted frame. For a moment, she lay there, the frigid water closing over her face, and a terrible, seductive peace whispered to her. It would be so easy to stop, to let the cold take her, to let the darkness win. But then she saw his face, the cruel twist of his smile, the deadness in his eyes, and a different kind of fire, a core of pure, defiant hatred, burned through the chill. She would not give him the satisfaction. She would not die in his shadow. With a guttural cry that was more animal than human, she pushed herself up, dragging her ruined leg behind her. It was then she saw it. Through the blinding curtain of rain, a flicker, a weak, yellow pinprick of light, impossibly distant and yet a beacon in the utter desolation. The cabin. Hope, a thing she had thought utterly extinguished, flared painfully in her chest. It was a cruel mirage, perhaps, a final trick of a dying mind. But it was all she had. Ignoring the agony in her ankle, she began to crawl, her fingers digging into the slick earth, pulling her broken body toward that single, fragile promise of light. The distance was a torment. An eternity passed in the space of 100 yards. Each foot gained a victory against the howling void. The light grew, steadied, became a window, a small, defiant square of warmth against the overwhelming night. She reached the edge of a clearing and saw the cabin's dark silhouette, a solid shape hunkered low against the wind. Smoke, torn to shreds the moment it left the stone chimney, spoke of a hearth within. She pulled herself onto the rough-hewn porch, her body a dead weight, leaving a smear of mud and blood on the weathered planks. Her knuckles were raw, her fingers numb, but she managed to raise a hand and beat it weakly against the solid wood of the door. The sound was pathetic, a frantic scratching lost in the storm's symphony. She tried again, a desperate, hollow thud. She slumped against the door, her consciousness fraying, the little yellow square of the window blurring and swimming before her eyes. The cold was absolute now, a final, heavy blanket. Just as the darkness began to claim her, she heard a sound from within, the scraping of a chair, the heavy tread of a boot. A bolt slid back with a loud, metallic clank that seemed to her the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. The door swung inward, and a wall of warm, dry air washed over her. A figure loomed in the doorway, a giant silhouetted against the firelight within, and then the world finally, mercifully, went black. She returned to the world in pieces. First came the warmth, a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to be drawing the very marrow of the cold from her bones. It was a strange and disorienting sensation, a slow, painful thawing. Then came the scent of wood smoke, of pine and drying wool. She was lying on something soft, a cot of some kind, and a heavy blanket was tucked tightly around her. Her dress, the tattered, mud-caked remnant of her old life, was gone. In its place, she felt the coarse, clean fabric of a man's shirt against her skin. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. Her eyes flew open. The cabin was small, a single room impeccably clean and sparse. The source of the heat was a great stone fireplace where a healthy fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. A rifle was mounted above the mantelpiece, its steel barrel gleaming. A man sat in a simple wooden chair by the hearth, his back to her, watching the flames. He was large, his shoulders broad beneath a dark woolen shirt. He had not seemed to notice she was awake. She tried to sit up, but a bolt of fire shot through her ankle, and she fell back with a choked gasp. The man turned his head. His face was all harsh angles and shadow, weathered by sun and wind. A thick, dark beard covered his jaw, and his eyes, when they met hers, were the color of a winter sky, a pale, flat gray that revealed nothing. There was no kindness in them, but no malice either. They simply were. He rose from his chair, his movements economical and deliberate. He was tall, taller than she had realized, and moved with a quiet authority that filled the small space. Alara shrank back against the cot, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was trapped. She had fled one monster only to deliver herself into the hands of another. He approached the cot, and she flinched, pulling the blanket up to her chin. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze dropping to her injured ankle, which was propped on a pillow, cleaned and expertly bound with clean strips of linen. He then looked at her arm, where a poultice of herbs had been applied to the gash. The bleeding stopped. He had done this. He had tended to her wounds while she was unconscious. He wordlessly turned away and went to the fireplace, ladling something from a black iron pot suspended over the flames. The aroma of rich broth filled the air, a scent so good it made her stomach ache with a hunger she hadn't known she possessed. He brought the steaming bowl to her, along with a wooden spoon. He didn't offer it, but simply set it on a small crate beside the cot. Then he retreated to his chair by the fire, picking up a piece of wood and a knife, and began to whittle, his attention seemingly absorbed by the task. He did not speak. He did not look at her again. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the whisper of his knife against the wood. Alara watched him, her fear warring with a profound confusion. This was not the behavior of a predator. It was the behavior of a man accustomed to solitude, a man whose world had been unexpectedly invaded. Trembling, she reached for the bowl. The broth was hot and savory, and as the warmth spread through her, it felt like the first act of kindness she had received in an age. She ate slowly, her eyes never leaving the silent figure by the fire. He had saved her from the storm, but what he would do with her now that the storm was inside his walls, she did not know. The next morning, the world was born anew, scrubbed clean and silent. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of pale, fragile blue and air so crisp it stung the lungs. Alara awoke to the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood, a steady, powerful beat that seemed to be the cabin's own heartbeat. Sunlight streamed through the single window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Her body ached with a deep, resonant soreness, but the sharp edges of the pain had dulled. The fever that had slicked her skin with sweat was gone. She pushed herself into a sitting position, her movements slow and cautious. The man's shirt she wore was laughably large, the sleeves rolled up a dozen times, yet it was clean and smelled of soap and wood smoke, felt like a shield. From the window she could see him, Silas Blackwood. The name had come to her in the night, dredged from the depths of memory. A name spoken in the distant town with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. A famous rancher who had lost his family and retreated into the mountains, buying up vast tracts of land and guarding them with a jealousy that bordered on obsession. A man who kept to himself, a ghost in his own territory. He worked with an unwavering, relentless rhythm, his powerful form moving with fluid efficiency. He swung the axe not with rage, but with a kind of focused purpose, as if he were shaping the world to his will, one log at a time. He was a part of the landscape, as rugged and unyielding as the granite peaks that loomed behind his cabin. He was not a monster. He was something far more complex, and perhaps more dangerous. A man hollowed out by grief, leaving only stone and silence behind. She felt a tremor of her old fear, but it was different now, tempered by a dawning understanding. He was not a threat to her in the way Jedediah had been. His danger lay in his profound isolation, in the formidable walls he had built around himself. She, a wounded stray, had somehow breached them. Later, he came inside, his face beaded with sweat, and set a bucket of fresh water by the door without looking at her. He moved to the hearth, stoked the fire, and began preparing a simple meal of oats and dried fruit. The silence was no longer a void, but a space with its own texture, its own unspoken rules. He ate his portion standing by the window, gazing out at the mountains. He left her bowl on the crate again, a silent offering. He was providing for her, meeting her basic needs for shelter, warmth, and food, but he offered nothing more. No words.
No comfort.
It was a stark, elemental kind of charity, as raw and unadorned as the wilderness outside. In the days that followed, a quiet routine settled over the cabin, as predictable as the rising and setting of the sun. Alara's body began to knit itself back together. The gash on her arm scabbed over, and the swelling in her ankle subsided, allowing her to limp around the small room. She spent hours watching Silas from the cot or the single chair, learning the cadences of his solitude. He was a man of immense self-sufficiency. He moved from one task to the next, mending a harness, sharpening his tools, cleaning his rifle, with a single-minded focus that left no room for idleness or introspection. He spoke only when absolutely necessary, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. More wood, he might say before heading out, or, snow's coming. They were observations, not invitations to conversation. Yet, in his silence, she began to find a strange sort of peace. It was a silence that demanded nothing of her. She did not have to explain the terror in her eyes, the story behind her wounds. He had taken her in as he might a wounded animal, and he seemed to expect nothing from her but the simple act of healing. Slowly, tentatively, she began to claim a small space for herself within his world. One afternoon, seeing a basket of his mending piled in a corner, she picked up a shirt with a torn sleeve. Her fingers, clumsy at first, found their old rhythm with the needle and thread she located in a small wooden box. She worked meticulously, her stitches small and even. When Silas came in that evening, he saw the neatly folded shirt on the table. He stopped, his gaze lingering on the tidy seam for a long moment. He said nothing, but the next day, he left a small, worn leather-bound book on the crate beside her cot. It was a book of poetry, its pages softened by countless readings. It was a gesture so unexpected, so contrary to the harsh exterior he presented to the world, that it brought tears to her eyes. Another day, while she was carefully tending to the small, hardy patch of herbs growing against the cabin's south wall, she found a small object tucked among the sage. It was a bird, carved from a single piece of pale pine, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. The detail was exquisite, each feather rendered with a patient, loving hand. She knew, without needing to be told, that he had carved it. She took it inside, its smooth, polished surface cool against her palm, and set it on the windowsill where the light would catch it. It was a fragile, beautiful thing in a world of harsh utility. It was a wordless conversation, a bridge of small, quiet offerings built across the chasm of their shared silence. Her fear of him had long since evaporated, replaced by a deep, aching curiosity about the man who lived behind the stone-gray eyes. One evening, the wind rose again, not with the violence of the storm that had brought her here, but with a low, mournful sigh that crept through the cracks in the log walls. The fire burned brightly, a bastion against the encroaching dark. Alara had grown stronger, the limp in her step almost gone. She sat in the chair opposite him, the book he had given her resting in her lap. The silence felt different tonight, heavier with unspoken things. For the first time, she felt bold enough to break it with more than a simple necessity. "This was your family's land?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. Silas looked up from the harness he was oiling, his hands stilling. He stared at her for a long moment, and she thought he would not answer. His gaze was unervingly direct, as if weighing her, judging her right to ask. "It is now," he finally said, his voice flat. He turned his attention back to his work, a clear dismissal. But the door, once opened a crack, would not fully close. Her eyes were drawn to the mantelpiece, to the one personal object in the entire cabin, aside from the mounted rifle. It was a small, silver-framed photograph, tarnished with age. She had looked at it 100 times, but never dared to touch it. Now, she found herself rising and limping towards the fireplace. She reached out a hesitant hand and picked it up. The photograph showed a woman with a gentle smile and eyes the same shade of winter sky gray as Silas's, and a small boy with a missing front tooth, his arm thrown around the woman's neck. They were standing in front of this very cabin, but the logs were newer then, the porch step not yet worn smooth. It was a ghost of a happier time, a life that had once filled these silent walls. "She was beautiful," Elara said softly, her back to him. She heard the soft thud of the leather harness being set on the floor. She did not need to turn around to feel his presence behind her, the weight of his grief filling the space between them. "Her name was Mary," he said, his voice thick with a rust he could not conceal. "The boy was Thomas." He did not say what happened. He did not need to. The story was etched into every line on his face, in the desolate emptiness of the cabin, in the fierce, protective solitude he had wrapped around himself like a shroud. In that moment, Elara understood. She was not the only one who had been pursued by a monster. His had simply come in a different form, fever or accident or some other random cruelty of this land, but it had taken his world all the same. She placed the photograph carefully back on the mantel, and when she turned, she saw not a hardened recluse, but a man drowning in a loss so profound it had frozen him in time. She saw her own pain reflected in his eyes, and a bond was forged between them, deeper than any words, in the shared, silent language of survival. The peace was a fragile, sun-drenched thing, and it was shattered by the sight of a lone rider. Silas saw him first. He was standing by the window, a cup of coffee halfway to his lips, his gaze fixed on the far edge of the valley. Elara, sweeping the hearth, noticed the sudden stillness in him. It was an absolute cessation of movement, the coiled tension of a wolf scenting danger on the wind. His shoulders hardened, and the muscles in his jaw knotted. "Get inside," he said. His voice was not loud, but it held a low, urgent command that chilled her to the bone. She froze, the broom slipping from her fingers. "What is it?" He didn't answer. He moved to the door, pulling it open just enough to peer out, his body shielding the interior from view. "Stay away from the window," he ordered, his eyes still scanning the distant figure, a black speck moving slowly against the green expanse of the meadow. The idyllic bubble they had inhabited for weeks burst, its iridescent surface vanishing into the harsh air. The world outside, the world she had fled, had found her. Silas closed the door, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden, tense silence. He walked to the mantelpiece and took down the rifle. The motion was fluid, familiar, terrifying in its ease. He checked the action, his hands moving with a grim purpose that spoke of a dark proficiency. The famous rancher, the man who guarded his territory with obsessive zeal. This was why. It wasn't just about land. It was about keeping the world, and all its attendant evils, at bay. The rider in the distance was a herald, a scout sent to probe his defenses. Jedediah. His name was a foul taste in her mouth. She had known, in some deep, unvisited part of her soul, that he would not give up. He was a man for whom possession was everything, and he considered her his. The terror she had kept locked away came rushing back, a suffocating tide. Her breath grew shallow, her hands cold and slick. She felt the phantom pains of her old injuries, the ghost of his hands on her. She backed away from the window as if it were poison, pressing herself into the far corner of the cabin, trying to make herself small, invisible. Silas glanced at her, his gray eyes taking in her stark fear. A flicker of something unreadable passed across his face. Not pity, but a kind of grim acknowledgement. He had sheltered her, and in doing so, he had invited her war to his doorstep. The rider eventually turned back, disappearing over the ridge. But they both knew it was not an ending. It was a prelude. The quiet sanctuary he had built against his own ghosts was about to become a battleground for hers. The morning broke cold and unnaturally still. There was no birdsong. The air itself seemed to be holding its breath. Silas had not slept. Alara had seen him sitting in his chair through the night, the rifle across his lap, a silent sentinel watching the darkness. He had put a fresh pot of coffee on to boil, the familiar ritual a stark contrast to the palpable tension that filled the cabin. Then came the sound, the soft thud of many hooves on damp earth, the jingle of bridles. They were not trying to be quiet. This was an arrival, an announcement. Alara's heart seized. She crept to the wall, finding a small chink between the logs, and peered out. There were at least a half-dozen of them, fanned out in a loose semicircle, effectively surrounding the front of the cabin. And in the center, sitting his horse with an arrogant slump, was Jedediah. He looked just as she remembered. His face fleshy and smug, his eyes small and mean. He had a new scar along his jaw she didn't recognize. He wore his cruelty like a fine coat. Blackwood. Jedediah's voice sliced through the morning quiet, oily and confident. I know you're in there. And I know you've got something that belongs to me. Silas moved to stand beside the heavy door. His own rifle held loosely in one hand, pointed at the floor. He did not answer. His silence was a weapon, a refusal to engage on Jedediah's terms. I got no quarrel with you, Blackwood. The voice continued, taking on a placating, reasonable tone that was more menacing than any shout. The girl you got in there, Alara, she's a thief. Stole a horse and a good sum of money from me. I just want my property back. Both kinds a lie. All of it. She had stolen nothing but her own life. A wave of nausea rolled through her. To be spoken of like an object, a runaway mare. She pressed her forehead against the rough wood of the wall, her eyes squeezed shut, the old helpless terror threatening to paralyze her. This was it. The end of the line. She had brought this violence and ugliness to the one place she had found a sliver of peace, to the one man who had shown her a stark, silent form of grace. Guilt warred with her fear. She had doomed him. Send her out, Blackwood, and we'll be on our way. No need for anyone to get hurt over a lying little tramp. The words were designed to provoke, to strip her of any dignity. And for a moment they worked. She felt herself shrink, the shame and fear a physical weight. But then she looked at Silas. He stood like a rock, unmoved, his expressionless face a mask of granite. He was not afraid. And in his stillness, she found a tiny, hard kernel of her own strength. Silas turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting hers across the room. He saw the terror, but he also saw the flicker of defiance she was trying so desperately to nurture. He did not look at her with pity, nor did he look at her as a burden. He looked at her as if she were a factor in an equation he was solving. He will not stop, Silas said, his voice low and even. It was the most he had said to her at one time. He'll burn the cabin to the ground to get to you. He was not asking her what to do. He was stating a fact. He was laying the truth of their situation bare. I can try to bargain for you, he continued, his eyes holding hers. He might take my horse, a price. But a man like that, his kind doesn't honor bargains for long. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Or we can fight. The choice hung in the air between them, heavy and absolute. He was not offering to save her. He was not the hero riding to the rescue of a damsel. He was offering her a partnership in survival, an alliance against the darkness. He was acknowledging that this was her fight as much as it was his. He walked to a large wooden chest in the corner, lifted the lid, and took out an old, heavy Colt pistol. It was worn, the metal faded, but it looked well-oiled and serviceable. He broke it open, checked that it was empty, and then walked back to her. He held it out, but first, "Do you know how to use one?" he asked. She shook her head, her eyes wide, fixed on the weapon. It felt like an impossible object. "It's not difficult," he said, his voice patient. He took a small box of cartridges from his pocket and, with methodical movements, showed her how to load each chamber. His large, rough hands were surprisingly gentle as he guided hers, positioning her fingers on the trigger, showing her how to aim. The cold, solid weight of the pistol in her hand was a terrifying, electrifying thing. It was an instrument of death, but it was also an instrument of will. It was power. It was a choice. His trust in her, this simple, profound act of arming her, was a greater gift than the food and shelter he had provided. It was a declaration that he saw her not as a victim to be protected, but as a survivor capable of fighting for herself. The terror in her veins did not vanish, but it began to change, to transmute into something else. It was crystallizing into a cold, hard resolve. Jedediah had taken everything from her. He would not take this. He would not take her life. Her hands still trembled, but she gripped the pistol tighter. "Show me again," she said, her voice small but steady. The world outside the cabin held its breath. Jedediah, growing impatient with the silence, shouted another threat, his voice laced with venom. "Last chance, Blackwood." Inside, time seemed to slow. Silas moved to the front window, peering through a narrow gap he had made in the shutters. Alara took her position at the small window at the back of the cabin, the one that looked out toward the woodshed. The heavy pistol felt like an anchor in her hands. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her mind was strangely clear. The fear was a physical thing, a cold knot in her stomach, but the paralyzing panic had been burned away by the flinty spark of Silas's trust. They waited. The first move came not as a frontal assault, but as a creeping threat from the side. One of Jedediah's men, a lanky man with a cruel face, broke from the line and began to circle toward the rear of the cabin, using the woodpile for cover. "Back window," Silas said, his voice a low growl, never taking his eyes from the front. "He's yours." The words struck her not as a command, but as a statement of fact. "He's yours." She pressed herself against the wall, the rough-hewn log cool against her cheek. She watched the man dart from the trees to the woodpile. He was close now, too close. He thought the back was unguarded. He crouched, drew his pistol, and made a dash for the window. In that instant, every lesson Silas had taught her in those few, tense minutes converged. She raised the Colt, both hands gripping it to steady its weight. She saw the man's face, his eyes alight with vicious intent as he lunged toward her sanctuary. It was him or her. It was his world or hers. She pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the small space. The recoil slammed her shoulder back against the wall, and the smell of gunpowder filled her nostrils, acrid and sharp. The man outside jerked backward as if punched, a look of pure, stupid surprise on his face. He stumbled, fell, and did not move again. For a moment, she stared, her ears ringing, her mind blank. She had done it. She had taken a life to save her own. There was no triumph, only a hollow, ringing finality. The shot was a signal. All hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from the front, the sharp crack of Jedediah's pistols answered by the deep, booming report of Silas's rifle, which splintered around the front window as bullets slammed into the cabin walls. Through it all, Silas was a figure of terrifying calm. He fired, worked the lever action of his rifle, and fired again, his movements precise and deadly. He was not a man defending his home. He was a force of nature scouring his territory of an invasive pest. Another of Jedediah's men went down. Seeing his numbers dwindling and his direct assault failing, Jedediah's voice rose in a furious, panicked roar. "Burn him out!" But it was too late. The balance had shifted. The remaining men, hired guns with no real stake in Jedediah's obsession, had lost their nerve. One broke and ran for the cover of the trees, his horse following. Then another. Soon, only Jedediah remained, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. He fired one last, wild shot at the cabin before wheeling his horse around. But Silas was already moving. He threw open the door and stepped onto the porch, his rifle leveled. "Jedediah!" His voice was the crack of doom. The man spurred his horse, but Silas's shot was true. Jedediah cried out and slumped forward in the saddle, his horse bolting into the wilderness with its dying rider. The silence that fell in the aftermath was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. It was a silence weighted with the ghosts of the morning's violence, thick with the scent of gunpowder and spilled blood. Alara stood frozen at her window, the heavy pistol still clutched in her hand, its barrel warm. The world outside was still, the fallen men dark shapes against the green grass. Silas stood on the porch for a long moment, the rifle held loosely at his side, his gaze sweeping the empty clearing. The war was over. He turned and walked back inside, his movements stiff. It was only then that she saw the dark stain spreading across his left sleeve, the blood dripping from his fingertips onto the floorboards. He looked at the wound with a kind of detached annoyance, as if it were a tear in his shirt rather than his flesh. He sank into his chair by the hearth, the rifle clattering to the floor beside him, and a wave of exhaustion seemed to wash over him, the granite facade finally cracking. Without a word, Alara put the pistol on the table. The terror, the rage, the adrenaline. It all drained away, leaving a strange, quiet emptiness. She went to the water bucket, soaked a clean cloth and knelt beside his chair. He watched her, his gray eyes clouded with pain but clear with a new light. She gently pushed the torn, bloody fabric of his sleeve aside. The bullet had torn through the muscle of his forearm, a clean but deep wound. Her hands, which had trembled holding the gun, were now steady. She cleaned the wound with the same methodical care he had once shown her. Their roles were reversed. She was no longer the wounded creature he had sheltered from the storm. She was his partner, tending to the wounds they had earned together. He did not flinch or pull away. He simply sat, allowing her to minister to him, a silent surrender of his formidable self-sufficiency. When she was done, she wrapped his arm tightly with fresh linen strips. Their eyes met, and in that shared gaze everything was said. There was no need for thanks or explanations. The fire they had walked through had burned away all but the essential truth of them. They were survivors. They had stood together against the darkness and held their ground. She had not merely been saved by him. She had, in the end, helped save him too. He had given her a sanctuary, and she had helped him defend it. Standing, she looked out the open door at the vast, unforgiving landscape. The mountains no longer seemed like a threat, but a promise. It was a hard land, a wild land, but it was their land. Her transformation was complete. She was not the broken woman who had crawled to his door. She was Alara, and she was home.